Hello, welcome to Learning Studio. In this video we will briefly discuss the first Greek philosophers, such as Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Pythagoras, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, Democritus. So, let's begin. The first philosophers. Magic, superstition, and mysticism, in one form or another, dominated attempts to understand nature for most of early history. It was therefore a monumental step in human thought when natural explanations were offered instead of supernatural ones. Such explanations, although understandably simple, were first offered by the early Greeks. Philosophy began when natural explanations replaced supernatural ones. Waterfield uses Kuhnian terminology to describe the importance of this development. The presocratic revolution was a genuine revolution, a paradigm shift of the first importance. The first philosophers were called cosmologists because they sought to explain the origin, the structure, and the processes governing the cosmos. However, the Greek word cosmos did not only refer to the totality of things but also suggested an elegant, ordered universe. The aesthetic aspect of the meaning of the term cosmos is reflected in the English word cosmetic. Thus, to the early Greek cosmologists, the universe was ordered and pleasant to contemplate. The assumption of orderliness was extremely important because an orderly universe is, at least in principle, an explicable universe. Thales, often referred to as the first philosopher, had a rich intellectual heritage. He traveled to Egypt and Babylonia, both of which enjoyed advanced civilizations that no doubt influenced him. For example, the Egyptians had possessed for centuries the knowledge of geometry that Thales demonstrated. In Egypt and Babylonia, however, knowledge was either practical or used primarily in a religious context. Thales was important because he emphasized natural explanations and minimized supernatural ones. That is, in his cosmology, Thales said that things in the universe consist of natural substances and are governed by natural principles. They do not reflect the whims of the gods. The universe is therefore knowable and within the realm of human understanding. Thales searched for that one substance or element from which everything else is derived. The Greeks called such a primary element or substance a physis, and those who sought it were physicists. Physicists to this day are searching for the stuff from which everything is made. Thales concluded that the physis was water because many things seem to be a form of water. Life depends on water. Water exists in many forms, and some water is found in everything. This conclusion that water is the primary substance had considerable merit. The most important of Thales' views is his statement that the world is made of water. This is neither so far-fetched as at first glance it might appear, nor yet a pure figment of imagination cut off from observation. Hydrogen, the stuff that generates water, has been held in our time to be the chemical element from which all other elements can be synthesized. The view that all matter is one is quite a reputable scientific hypothesis. As for observation, the proximity of the sea makes it more than plausible that one should notice that the sun evaporates water. That mists rise from the surface to form clouds, which dissolve again in the form of rain. The earth in this view is a form of concentrated water. The details might thus be fanciful enough, but it is still a handsome feat to have discovered that a substance remains the same in different states of aggregation. Thales also predicted eclipses, developed methods of navigation based on the stars and planets, and applied geometric principles to the measurement of such things as the heights of buildings. He is even said to have cornered the market on olive oil by predicting weather patterns. Such practical accomplishments brought great fame to Thales and respectability to philosophy. Thales showed that a knowledge of nature, which minimized supernaturalism, could provide power over the environment, something humans had been seeking since the dawn of history. Perhaps the most important thing about Thales, however, was the fact that he offered his ideas as speculations and welcomed criticism. With his invitation for others to criticize and improve on his teachings, Thales started the critical tradition that was to characterize early Greek philosophy. I like to think that Thales was the first teacher who said to his students, "This is how I see things, how I believe that things are. Try to improve upon my teaching." We will have more to say about the importance of this critical tradition later in another video. Anaximander, who studied with Thales, argued that even water was a compound of more basic material. According to Anaximander, the physis was something that had the capability of becoming anything. This something he called the boundless or the indefinite. Anaximander also proposed a rudimentary theory of evolution. From a mixture of hot water and earth, there arose fish. Because human infants cannot survive without a long period of protection, the first human infants grew inside these fish until puberty, at which time the carrier fish burst and humans that were developed enough to survive on their own emerged. Anaximander urged us not to eat fish because they are, in a sense, our mothers and fathers. We can see how the physical environment can influence one's philosophizing. Both Thales and Anaximander lived near the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, and its influence on their philosophies is obvious. Heraclitus, Impressed by the fact that everything in nature seemed to be in a constant state of flux or change, Heraclitus assumed fire to be the physis because in the presence of fire everything is transformed into something else. To Heraclitus, the overwhelming fact about the world was that nothing ever is, rather, everything is becoming. Nothing is either hot or cold but is becoming hotter or colder. Nothing is fast or slow but is becoming faster or slower. Heraclitus's position is summarized in his famous statement, "It is impossible to step twice into the same river." Heraclitus meant that the river becomes something other than what it was when it was first stepped into. Heraclitus believed that all things existed somewhere between polar opposites. For example, night-day, life-death, winter-summer, up-down, heat-cold, sleeping-waking. For him, one end of the pole defined the other, and the two poles were inseparable. Only through injustice can justice be known, and only through health can illness be known. Heraclitus raised an epistemological question that has persisted to this day. How can something be known if it is constantly changing? If something is different at 2 points in time and therefore not really the same object, how can it be known with certainty? Does not knowledge require permanence? It was at this point in history that the senses became a questionable means of acquiring knowledge because they could provide information only about a constantly changing world. In answer to the question, what can be known with certainty? Empirical events could not be included because they were in a constant state of flux. Those seeking something unchangeable, and thus knowable, had two choices. They could choose something that was real but undetectable by the senses, as the atomists and the Pythagorean mathematicians did, or they could choose something mental, as the Platonists and the Christians did. Both groups believed that anything experienced through the senses was too unreliable to be known. Even today, the goal of science is to discover general laws that are abstractions derived from sensory experience. Scientific laws as abstractions are thought to be flawless when manifested in the empirical world. However, they are only probabilistic. Heraclitus's philosophy clearly described the major problem inherent in various brands of empiricism. That is, the physical world is in a constant state of flux, and even if our sense receptors could accurately detect physical objects and events, we would be aware only of objects and events that change from moment to moment. It is for this reason that empiricists are said to be concerned with the process of becoming rather than with being. Being implies permanence and thus at least the possibility of certain knowledge, whereas a knowledge of empirical events can be only probabilistic at best. Throughout psychology's history, those claiming that there are certain permanent and therefore knowable things about the universe or about humans have tended to be rationalists. Those saying that everything in the universe, including humans, is constantly changing and thus incapable of being known with certainty have tended to be empiricists. Parmenides. Taking a view exactly the opposite of Heraclitus's, Parmenides believed that all change was an illusion. There is only one reality. It is finite, uniform, motionless, and fixed and can be understood only through reason. Thus, for Parmenides, knowledge is attained only through rational thought because sensory experience provides only illusion. Parmenides supported his position with logic. Like the earliest humans, he believed that being able to speak or think of something implied its existence because we cannot think of something that does not exist. The following is a summary of Parmenides' argument. When you think of something. When you use a name, it must be of something. Therefore, both thought and language require objects outside themselves. And since you can think of a thing or speak of it at one time as well as another, whatever can be thought or spoken of must exist at all times. Consequently, there can be no change, since change consists in things coming into being and ceasing to be. Zeno of Elea, a disciple of Parmenides, used logical arguments to show that motion was an illusion. He said that for an object to go from point A to point B, it must first go half the distance between A and B, then it must go half the remaining distance, then half of that distance, and so on. Because there is an infinite number of points between any 2 points, the process can never stop. Also, the object must pass through an infinite number of points in a finite amount of time, and this is impossible. Therefore, it is logically impossible for the object ever to reach point B. The fact that it seems to do so is a weakness of the senses. This reasoning, usually known as Zeno's paradox, is often expressed in the following form. If one runner in a race is allowed to leave slightly before a second runner, the second runner can never overtake the first runner, no matter how slow the first runner or how swift the second. We have in Parmenides and Zeno examples of how far unabated reason can take a person. They concluded that either logic, mathematics, and reason were correct or the information provided by the senses was, and they opted for logic, mathematics, and reason. The same mistake has been made many times in history. Other misconceptions can result from relying exclusively on sensory data. It was not until science emerged in the 16th century that rationalism and empiricism were wed in sensory information provided that which was reasoned about. Science therefore minimized the extremes of both rationalism and empiricism. Pythagoras. Largely through his influence on Plato, has had a significant influence on Western thought. It is said that Pythagoras was the first to employ the term philosophy, and to refer to himself as a philosopher. Pythagoras postulated that the basic explanation for everything in the universe was found in numbers and in numerical relationships. He noted that the square of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is exactly equal to the sum of the squares of its other two sides. Although this came to be called the Pythagorean theorem, it had probably been known to the Babylonians previously. Pythagoras also observed that a harmonious blending of tone results when one string on a lyre is exactly twice as long as another. This observation that strings of a lyre must bear certain relationships with one another to produce pleasant, harmonious sounds was, perhaps, psychology's first psychophysical law. Indeed, physical events were demonstrated to be systematically related to psychological events. In fact, the Pythagoreans expressed this psychophysical relationship in mathematical terms. Just as pleasant music results from the harmonious blending of certain tones, so too does health depend on the harmonious blending of bodily elements. The Pythagoreans thought illness resulted from a disruption of the body's equilibrium, and medical treatment consisted of attempts to restore that equilibrium. Pythagoras took these and several other observations and created a school of thought that glorified mathematics. He and his followers applied mathematical principles to almost every aspect of human existence, creating a great muddle of religious mysticism, music, mathematics, medicine, and cosmology. According to the Pythagoreans, numbers and numerical relationships, although abstract, were nonetheless real and exerted an influence on the empirical world. The world of numbers existed independently of the empirical world and could be known in its pure form only through reason. When conceptualized, the Pythagorean theorem is exactly correct and applies to all right-angled triangles that ever were or ever will be. As long as the theorem is applied rationally to imagined triangles, it is flawless when applied to actual triangles. However, the results are not absolutely correct because there are no perfect triangles in the empirical world. In fact, according to the Pythagoreans, nothing is perfect in the empirical world. Perfection is found only in the abstract mathematical world that lies beyond the senses and therefore can be embraced only by reason. The Pythagoreans assumed a dualistic universe, one part abstract, permanent, and intellectually knowable and the other empirical, changing, and known through the senses. Sensory experience, then, cannot provide knowledge. In fact, such experience interferes with the attainment of knowledge and should be avoided. This viewpoint grew into outright contempt for sensory experiences and for bodily pleasures, and the Pythagoreans launched a crusade against vice, lawlessness, and bodily excess of any type. Members of this school imposed on themselves long periods of silence to enhance clear, rational thought. Moreover, they attempted to cleanse their minds by imposing certain taboos and by hard physical and mental exercise. The taboos included eating flesh and eating beans. Among other things, beans cause excessive flatulence, a condition contrary to the tranquility of mind necessary for seeking the truth. In a sense, the Pythagoreans introduced an early version of the belief you are what you eat. They believed that each kind of food that is introduced into the human body becomes the cause of a certain peculiar disposition. The Pythagoreans believed that the universe was characterized by a mathematical harmony, and that everything in nature was interrelated. Following this viewpoint, they encouraged women to join their organization, argued for the humane treatment of slaves, and, as mentioned, developed medical practices based on the assumption that health resulted from the harmonious workings of the body and illness resulted from some type of imbalance or discord. The belief that experiences of the flesh are inferior to those of the mind, a belief that plays such an important role in Plato's theory and is even more important in early Christian theology, can be traced directly to the Pythagoreans. Eventually, Plato became a member of their organization. He based his academy on Pythagorean concepts, and a sign above the entrance read, "Let no one without an understanding of mathematics enter here." Pythagoras postulated two worlds, one physical and one abstract, the two interacting with each other. Of the two, the abstract was considered the better. Pythagoras also postulated a dualism in humans, claiming that, in addition to the flesh of the body, we have reasoning powers that allow us to attain an understanding of the abstract world. Furthermore, reasoning is a function of the soul, which the Pythagoreans believed to be immortal. Pythagoras' philosophy provides one of the first clear-cut mind-body dualisms in the history of Western thought. We see many elements in common between Dionysiac Orphic religion and Pythagorean philosophy. Both viewed the body as a prison from which the soul should escape, or, at the very least, the soul should minimize the lusts of the vile body that houses it by engaging in the rational contemplation of unchanging truths. Both accepted the notion of the transmigration of souls, and both believed that only purification could stop the circle of births. The notion of transmigration fostered in the Pythagoreans a spirit of kinship with all living things. It is for this reason that they accepted women into their organizations, argued for the humane treatment of slaves, and were opposed to the maltreatment of animals. It is said of Pythagoras that when he passed a puppy that was being whipped, he took pity on it and made this remark, "Stop, do not beat it, for it is the soul of a dear friend." It was for the same reason that the Pythagoreans were vegetarians. The origin of other Pythagorean taboos is more difficult to determine. For example, do not urinate towards the sun. We will see in next video that Plato borrowed much from the Pythagoreans. It was through Platonic philosophy that elements of the Dionysiac Orphic religion became part of the heritage of Western civilization. Empedocles was a physician and a disciple of Pythagoras. He claimed his soul had been migrating for quite a while. "For already have I become a boy and a girl and a bush and a bird and a silent fish in the sea." Instead of one physis, Empedocles suggested 4 elements from which everything in the world is made: earth, fire, air, and water. Humans, too, he thought, consist of these 4 elements, with earth forming the solid part of the body, water accounting for the liquids in the body, air providing the breath of life, and fire providing our reasoning ability. Besides the 4 elements, Empedocles postulated 2 causal powers of the universe: love and strife. Love is a force that attracts and mixes the elements, and strife is a force that separates the elements. Operating together, these 2 forces create an unending cosmic cycle consisting of 4 recurring phases. In phase 1, love dominates and there is a perfect mixture of the 4 elements. In phase 2, strife disrupts the perfect mixture by progressively separating them. In phase 3, strife has managed to completely separate the elements. In phase 4, love again becomes increasingly dominant, and elements are gradually recombined. As this cycle recurs, new worlds come into existence and then are destroyed. A world consisting of things we would recognize could exist only during the 2nd and 4th phases of the cycle, when a mixture of the elements can exist. Along with the 4 elements, humans also possess the forces of love and strife, and these forces wax and wane within us just as they do in other material bodies. When love dominates, we have an urge to establish a union with the world and with other people. When strife dominates, we seek separation. Clearly, the ingredients are here for the types of intrapersonal and extrapersonal conflicts described by Freud and others much later in human history. For Empedocles, the 4 elements and the forces of love and strife have always existed. In fact, all that can ever be must be a mixture of the elements and the 2 forces. Nothing beyond these mixtures is possible. He said, "From what does not exist nothing can come into being. And for what exists to be destroyed is impossible and unaccomplishable." This is similar to the modern law of conservation of energy, which states that energy can take different forms but cannot be created or destroyed. Empedocles also offered a theory of evolution that was more complex than the one previously suggested by Anaximander. In the phase when there is a mixture of love and strife, all types of things are created, some of them very bizarre. Animals did not form all at once but part by part. And the same was true of humans. Many necklace heads sprang up, naked arms wandered, devoid of shoulders, and eyes strayed alone, begging for foreheads. As these various body parts roamed around, they were combined in a random fashion. Many grew double-headed, double-chested, man-faced oxen arose, and again ox-headed men, creatures mixed partly from male partly from female nature. Elsewhere, Empedocles described what happens when the 4 elements are acted on by love and strife. As they mingled, innumerable types of mortal things poured forth, fitted with every sort of shape, a wonder to see. Most random pairings resulted in creatures incapable of surviving, and they eventually perished. Some chance unions produced viable creatures, however, and they survived, humans among them. What we have here is an early version of natural selection by the survival. Empedocles was also the first philosopher to offer a theory of perception. He assumed that each of the 4 elements was found in the blood. Objects in the outside environment throw off tiny copies of themselves called emanations, or idola, which enter the blood through the pores of the body. Because like attracts like, the idola will combine with elements that are like them. The fusion of external elements with internal elements results in perception. Empedocles believed that the matching of idola with their corresponding internal elements occurred in the heart, because Empedocles was the first to attempt to describe how we form images of the world through a process similar to sensory perception. He is sometimes referred to as the first empirical philosopher. His view was that we perceive objects by internalizing copies of them. To the Pythagorean notion that health reflected a bodily equilibrium, Empedocles added the 4 elements. Health occurs when the 4 elements of the body are in proper balance. Illness results when they are not. Anaxagoras, a close friend and mentor of Pericles, taught that all things in the world as we know it were originally mixed together. Furthermore, everything in our world, including humans, continues to be aggregates of that primordial mixture. Like Empedocles, Anaxagoras believed nothing can come from nothing. However, whereas Empedocles postulated 4 elements from which everything is derived, Anaxagoras postulated an infinite number of elements that he referred to as seeds. As examples of these elements or seeds, Anaxagoras listed water, fire, hair, bread, meat, air, wet, dry, hot, cold, thin, thick, wood, metal, and stone. However, these elements or seeds do not exist in isolation. Every element contains all the other elements. How then do objects become differentiated? Waterfield explains, everything is present in every seed and in every item of the universe, but in different proportions. It is the difference in the proportion of the seeds present that give objects their characteristics. Things appear to be that of which they contain the most. Thus, for example, everything contains fire, but we only call it fire if that element predominates. There was a single exception to Anaxagoras' claim that everything contains everything. Mind, he said, is pure in the sense that it contains no other elements. Also, mind is not necessarily present in other elements. Where it is present, life exists. For example, mind is present in humans and other living things, but not in such things as stones or rivers. Anaxagoras was, therefore, a vitalist. There was no providence in Anaxagoras' philosophy, and he said little about ethics and religion. He was accused of atheism by his contemporaries, and, according to Russell, this accusation was probably true. Democritus. Democritus was the last of the early Greek cosmologists. Later philosophers were more concerned with human nature than with the nature of the physical universe. Democritus said that all things are made of tiny, indivisible parts called atoms. The differences among things are explained by the shape, size, number, location, and arrangement of atoms. Atoms themselves were believed to be unalterable, but they could have different arrangements, so although the actual atoms do not change, the objects that are made of them can change. Humans, too, are bundles of atoms, and the soul or mind is made up of smooth, highly mobile fire atoms that provide our mental experiences. For Democritus, therefore, animate, inanimate, and cognitive events were reduced to atoms and atomic activity. Because the behavior of atoms was thought to be lawful, Democritus's view was deterministic. It also exemplified physical monism because everything was explained in terms of the arrangement of atoms and there was no separate life force, that is, he denied vitalism. Democritus's view also incorporated elementism because no matter how complex something was, Democritus believed it could be explained in terms of atoms and their activity. Finally, Democritus's philosophy exemplified reductionism because he attempted to explain objects and events on one level in terms of events on another level. Reductionism is contrasted with elementism in that the former involves 2 different domains of explanation, whereas the latter attempts to understand a complex phenomenon by separating it into its simpler component parts. Attempting to explain human behavior in terms of biochemical processes would exemplify reductionism, as would attempting to explain biochemical processes in terms of physics. Attempting to understand human thought processes by isolating and studying one process at a time, or attempting to understand complex human behavior by isolating specific habits or stimulus-response associations would exemplify elementism. Democritus was both a reductionist and an elementist. The explanations of sensation and perception offered by Empedocles and Democritus both emphasized the importance of idola. However, for Democritus, sensations and perceptions arise when atoms emanate from the surfaces of objects and enter the body through one of the 5 sensory systems and are transmitted to the brain. Upon entering the brain, the emanations sent by an object cause the highly mobile fire atoms to form a copy of them. This match between idola and atoms in the brain causes perception. Democritus stressed that idola are not the object itself and that the match between the idola and the atoms in the brain may not be exact. Therefore, there may be differences between the physical object and the perception of it. As noted, one of the most persistent problems in psychology has been determining what is gained or lost as objects in the environment are experienced through the senses. Democritus placed thinking in the brain, emotion in the heart, and appetite in the liver. He discussed 5 senses: vision, hearing, smell, touch, and taste, and suggested 4 primary colors: black, red, white, and green, from which all colors were derived. Because he believed that all bodily atoms scattered at death, he also believed that there was no life after death. His was the first completely naturalistic view of the universe, devoid of any supernatural considerations. Although his view contained no gods or spirits to guide human action, Democritus did not condone a life of hedonism. He preached moderation, as did his disciple Epicurus 100 years later. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.